Welcome to the course MST-014 Ecosystem Economics. Session is about KYOTO Protocol, one of the first protocols emerging for climate change, adaptation and mitigation. In this, we'll be talking about climate change and why we need to reduce emissions. Giving a bit of historical development, as you know, there has been a huge international concern over the environmental impacts of world's uncontrolled use of coal, oil and gas over the years that has grown exponentially, especially after second half of the 20th century. Now, climate change has resulted in a huge impact on not only plants and animals, but also on our environment. So, phenomena like acid rain drainage, greenhouse gas emissions, and their impact on human health has been very strong and has been very visible in last few decades. We might not be that aware, but 1980s was the time where slowly awareness started to begin on the possible reasons behind climate change. And these possible reasons was strongly coming from the fossil fuel industry. The concentration of greenhouse gases that are released in the environment when fossil fuels are burnt has been increasing in the atmosphere. And that is one of the major culprits, especially during industrial revolution and after that has led to global warming. Now, if I talk about the adverse impact of prospective climate change, there are many. And I'm sure many of you know that extreme weather events, extreme shift in rainfall patterns, excessive heat, heat stress, heat islands, these are one way or other related to climate change. Now, climate change has not only affected the environment and environmental shifts and changes, it has affected our agriculture, so there is reduced crop supply. It has also resulted in decreased water availability. So, water shortage across the world has been one of the reasons that climate change has provided and accelerated. There are also increasing intensity of vector-borne diseases like malaria and also cholera and other waterborne diseases. So, these are some of the negative and stronger negative impacts of climate change. We know that there has been a huge increase in heat stress, and that heat stress has resulted in stress mortality in humans, livestock, wildlife and so on and so forth. In last few decades, our country is facing enhanced intensity and frequency of floods in Himalayan region, Indo-Gangetic belt, the Brahmaputra river, Kosi river. So these are common examples. Landslides have increased both in eastern and western Himalayas and is leading to death of a lot of people and also resulting in loss of livelihood, loss of economics, loss and accident of so many other related human beings. Now, avalanche and mudslide are another important reasons because of climate change. So overall, we know that climate change is a severe situation that humanity is right now facing. We also know that in last few decades, there has been recession and climate change has also resulted in snow melting and also glacier recession. And this receding on glaciers and sea level rise has resulted to submergence of many coastal areas. So sea level rise is again a problem for a country like India that has very long coastline. Now, coming to the response of greenhouse gas, there are three important ways actually how it should be controlled. So there are three different ways, as I mentioned. These are adaptation, offsetting and mitigation. Where you know adaptation involves having certain kind of measures that are according to the changing environment. For example, growing crops that are climate adaptive and can withstand shift in climate regimes, be it temperature shifts or rainfall shifts or snow pattern shifts. So they are adapted towards these changing weather conditions. Now, similarly, there are crops that can withstand in coastal areas. So these are called as adaptation measures. Another important area is offsetting, and offsetting, as you know, is important because it increases the chances of reflecting the solar radiation back into the space. Unfortunately, offsetting has been not a very guaranteed way of scientifically achieving this approach. So offsetting has not been discussed much and there is not substantial discussion happening in the present context. We all know that the concentration of greenhouse gases is a very, very irreversible process. something that is trapped in our environment, in the environment of planet Earth, is very tough to shift it or send it back to the atmosphere outside planet Earth. Now, third important approach after adaptation and mitigation is adaptation and offsetting is mitigation. And mitigation is something that reduces the impact of climate change or vulnerable impacts of climate change by reducing the rate of discharge of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So that means we have to reduce emission of greenhouse gases, be it carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and so on and so forth. Now, this has been a basic understanding about climate change, its impacts, and what are the ways we can adapt, offset, or mitigate climate change. Now, over the history of discussions and research in climate change, mitigation is the area that has received more attention by global research or scientific community. It has been found that at present conservative estimate, the way population is exponentially growing and the way our economic development and activity is taking place, that there is a moderate aspiration and modest aspiration of people for higher economic growth. And we have to keep it in mind that it takes almost 50% of emission reduction to keep the carbon dioxide concentration alone at the present level. So that's a huge responsibility. Given the gravity of situation, mitigation can be a best way of reducing emissions of carbon dioxide, and this has received priority in international decisions and discussions related to climate change reduction. Now, reducing emission per US dollar of GDP is called as decarbonization of the economy, and decarbonization of economy is a very, very important concept when we are talking in present context. Everything has to be decarbonized. So that means our dependence coming on fossil fuel, coming from coal has to be reduced. And we have to shift to cleaner technologies that are not having emissions back in the environment. Mitigation also carry negative costs that are referred as no regret options. Now, again, this is an important terminology that you need to keep in your mind. And it is because they would make sense to do so independent of climate change problems. So what we do something that doesn't have any regret are important ways to actually that carries negative cost and can help us reach at decarbonization of the economy. Now, it is also important to understand that in third assessment report of IPCC, there was discussion on understanding the barriers and limitations for adaptation of feasible mitigation possibilities. While from third assessment report to now in 2022, we have actually seen substantial shift and discussions happening in the area of climate change. Now, as we are developing our concepts and understanding the basic about climate change mitigation, I would like to also narrate and discuss some of these important terminologies. And one of the very important terminologies is free rider problems of climate change mitigation. Now, for you, free rider problem is basically a situation where selfish individuals or selfish countries try to conceal their willingness to pay for public good and provision. So when I say public good and provision, that means good for everybody in the world, because environment has stakes by all nations in the world. So this selfish lot of individuals, in this context, countries, will not pay, hoping that others will not conceal their willingness to pay, and that what others will pay for provision, which non-payers will actually enjoy. So without paying anything, they are going to enjoy the benefits. So this is called as free rider problem of climate change mitigation, and people will try to get a free ride while others pay for reducing or mitigating climate change. So now the major GHG mix has been present uniformly in the atmosphere. So something that's here in Asia is also present in Europe, Americas, Australias, and also Africa. And it is the global concentration of GHGs that is affecting Earth's heat balance, especially the carbon budget is affecting the heat balance of the world. And hence, it has also affected the global climate. So the option and opportunity for free rider problems should not be appreciated and is not actually very much promoted in these discussions. And it is also important to understand that climate effect of a given molecule of greenhouse gas in no way is where, and it doesn't depend on where it was originated. For example, it has been assumed, and it is being discussed all along this historical debate, that most of the emission that is in our present environment has been done right from the Industrial Revolution that started long back, almost 200 to 300 years back, in European countries as well as in Americas. Now we know that carbon has an age of about 200 years. So something that was emitted almost 200 years back is still present in our atmosphere. And we don't know if its location is right now over Europe or Africa or Asia. So that is one of the important context where everybody has to have a responsibility to ensure that we take care of planet Earth and ensure contribution in climate change mitigation. Now, pollution due to increasing GHGs in the atmosphere is a public bad, and the associated damage is non-rival, non-excludable, and is going to deal with involves the free rider problem. So without addressing the free rider problem, it's very, very tough to actually address the larger context of climate change mitigation. And it is also important to understand that by analyzing the situation, where outcome of a decision that is made by an agent or a player depends on how everybody gets involved in the decision and how everybody contributes to the decision making for a possible good and good for everybody. Now, when I am talking about climate change and discussing this problem, we have to understand that every country in this world can actually go for two important courses of action. It can be either do nothing, that we called as business as usual scenario in climate science, or the second option is to reduce greenhouse gas emission by a fixed amount of mitigation. So we have only two options. It is either business as usual or do mitigation. So if only one country mitigates and incurs the cost, other benefit without incurring any cost, but the country that mitigates does not get all the benefit. So whether a country like India does all this mitigation or doesn't contribute in this mitigation will have two kinds of opportunities. And the most important thing is any country like India should be part of this mitigation exercise, and everybody should participate in this mitigation approach. Hence, for the problem for which benefits are common, if benefits are coming for the entire global community, the cost also have to be borne by each and every country. And there should be a mutual agreement, and there should be punishment for all the non-compliance of the agreement. So now this was a very initial discussion that started from the very 80s and that took shape in last 40 years. So if each country is going to pursue its own interest in isolation, there will be actually no mitigation, because nobody would like to put up a cost to mitigate climate change, mitigate the impact of greenhouse gas emissions, and the brunt has to be actually borne by the entire world. Acting alone is not going to make a country worse off. That's also important to note. And the best thing is actually the free ride on the mitigation of the other country. We don't have to be the free rider in climate change and have to ensure that we take part in mitigating climate change through our local as well as national efforts. Now, business as usual is clearly the dominant strategy for North as well as countries in global South. So it is not that something countries and developed countries in North are doing that countries in South don't need to do. It has to be an all-inclusive effort in climate mitigation. Now, suppose that North and South don't act cooperatively, what will happen? Rather, they cannot work in isolation. So a cooperation is required, especially also considering the fact of climate justice that is very much related with human rights and human justice. Now, I will give you an opportunity to understand that suppose there is a credible and binding agreement that could be negotiated according to which North could mitigate and South did, and vice versa. With such an agreement in place, things might look very different, because mitigation is broadly a preferred strategy not only for North or South but for both of them. So business as usual for both, to mitigate or not to mitigate, for both the countries. The latter is actually better than the former case. So in that case, we cannot promote business as usual, but have to prepare and promote mitigation as the best strategy. Now, this was the very foundation of climate change discussions, as I mentioned, that started right from 1980s. And this was also the foundation stone for evolution of the Kyoto Protocol. Now, this was a very historical protocol, and I must say in 1922, where we are standing right now, just last year we have concluded Glasgow COP, and it has come up with nature-based climate solution. It has also talked about climate financing and how best this climate mitigation can take place. Now, going back to the topic of Kyoto Protocol, it was very late in 1988 when two important United Nations agencies, the United Nations Environment Programme as well as the World Meteorological Organization, or WMO, they were the first who came together and formed a panel, and this intergovernmental panel was known as IPCC. Now, IPCC stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And IPCC was responsible throughout this period, and they came up with series of reports, special reports that are related to climate change. And the first assessment report was released sometime in 1990. Now, right from starting from 1990 and now coming to 2022, we know we are standing in a very, very important stage of this discussion. In 21 and 22, two important reports were released by IPCC. The one was Physical Sciences Report, and second one was Climate Vulnerability and Adaptation Report. Apart from that, in 2021, there was another report that was released and that mentioned that climate change and biodiversity cannot be dealt in silos because both of them are interrelated. Loss of biodiversity is also leading to climate change, and impact of climate change is also going to affect biodiversity. So this is a brief about the genesis. Now, going back to Kyoto Protocol, the first protocol that took place in 1990. In November 1990, United Nations General Assembly agreed to establish a process, and this process was aimed at negotiating and adopting an international agreement, especially a climate convention that is to be ready for countries to sign at the Earth Summit that was happening in Rio de Janeiro in the year 1992. Now, UNFCCC opened this for signature on May 1992 after an intergovernmental negotiating committee produced the text for the Framework Convention, and this was in a form of a report, followed by its meeting in New York. Now, Kyoto Protocol came into force in March 1994, almost after 2 years. And the negotiation process also involved nearly all the world's nations and also a lot of observers that were from business community, from industries, and also environmental organizations like IUCN and also Greenpeace. While many countries in this process wish to see legally binding limits on greenhouse gases that were including in the convention, and the convention also required the first meeting of parties, that is now called as COP or Climate COP, to review the advocacy and advocacy of the commitment. So that was a very important turning point. Now, moving to this, the third COP took place in Kyoto in Japan on 11 December 97, and they were involved with many more negotiations and finally adopted a protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol is part of UNFCCC, has come into force in 2005 finally, and countries that ratified are now bound by protocol requirements. So what are the protocol requirements? We will also discuss some aspects about this. Kyoto Protocol is significant because it introduces for the first time a very legally binding greenhouse gas emission commitments for the developed countries, because they are also considered the ones who were part of these emissions even before developing and underdeveloping countries started emissions. So at COP15, no binding framework was created. The 2 degree centigrade target temperature prevailed due to high cost associated with the 5 degree centigrade decrease. Now, I would like to link this with the present discussions that happened in Glasgow COP. We all know that right now this discussion started from 5 degrees centigrade decrease, and there was consensus on 2 degrees centigrade decrease. By 2021, we were standing on 1.5 degrees centigrade decrease, but somewhere the discussion moved in the direction where the increase will be by 2.4 degrees centigrade and 2.7 degrees centigrade. So we are somewhere moving around where the increase will be somewhere about 3 degrees centigrade. So you can see the failure of this entire discussion and all the development in last all these years. So the goal of reducing for Kyoto Protocol was to reduce global carbon dioxide emission by 50% and 80% for industrialized nation. This was further dropped because there was no mechanism in place to mobilize almost $100 billion by 2020, and especially for developing countries. And I must say climate financing is still one of the most area that has not been efficiently discussed, and even if it was efficiently discussed, there are countries that have not efficiently contributed to this climate financing. So most of these developed countries are very much hesitant to contribute to this. So now there was no decision made because developed countries were to provide funding and they were not substantially providing the funding. So there was no binding framework created. There were no obligations on developing countries to make the cuts. So that was one of the critical points of this entire Kyoto Protocol. Now, moving beyond this historical development, between November and December 2020, signatories of the Kyoto Protocol gathered in Cancun, Mexico in COP16. And there was this agreement called on rich countries to reduce their GHG emissions. And they had to pledge in Copenhagen Accord and for developing countries to plan to reduce their emissions. And this agreement also asked for a green climate fund that was proposed to be worth $100 billion a year by 2020 to assist poorer countries in financing emission reductions and also adaptation. Now, I would also mention that Green Climate Fund is finally here. They have their headquarters in South Korea, and they are doing some good funding mechanism and funding support to emission reduction and adaptation to underdeveloped and poor countries across the world. Now, when I talk about post-Kyoto commitments, the most important aspects are that I'm going to discuss. The first and foremost important one is ratification and enforcement. So the Kyoto Protocol was ratified and it came into force in 2005. Now ratification is, for example, one thing is being a signatory. So there are countries that sign the treaty and sign the protocol, and second thing is ratification. So once you ratify, that means you have to have national policies to realize the goals and targets of the protocol. So basically post-Kyoto in COP17, it failed to produce a binding post-Kyoto commitment, and this was later on referred as the Kyoto gap. At the same time, alternatively, the components of Kyoto Protocol could not be carved into smaller pieces of actions that were called as a stepped or parceled approach that may offer a more palatable, politically viable menu for the countries across the world to implement it. So the current Kyoto Protocol binds only the emission of industrialized countries from 2008 to 2012. Now from 2012 to 2022, there has been a significant development, and in 2015, Paris COP promises were signed, where countries came up with NDCs or nationally determined targets to reduce their emissions and contribute their mitigation through different approaches. So reducing the emission, enhancing carbon sinks outside forest areas, or enhancing the forest cover. So these were some of the approaches that took place after 2012. Now moving to the next one, again going back and discussing about Kyoto mechanism for a little more clarity. So the Kyoto Protocol allowed countries to come together as a group, and in this, which is an entity, and it has emission reduction commitment, so that then for the group to decide, there were individual commitments to its member. And so they were also group commitments for a group of countries, and especially the richer countries were to reduce emissions while the poorer can increase them. So now this was an important part of this mechanism where both poor and rich countries came together and made independent, individual as well as group commitments. So under the Kyoto Protocol, again there were few provisions. One was flexibility provision. So this is also called as flexibility provision because it relates to how these commitments are going to be met. So these can be classified, as I mentioned earlier, in internal and external flexibility, again with two dimensions. First, the target referred to the total of several greenhouse gases are to be added together in terms of their carbon dioxide equivalent. Second thing is, Kyoto Protocol did not say by how much emissions of each greenhouse gases should be cut. And this was basically left to each Annexure 1 countries or Annexure 1 parties to decide that how much cut they would like to have. There was also effect of land use changes that was considered in Kyoto Protocol in the flexibility provision. So this was related to carbon sinks or carbon sequestration potential. So that means if there are land use changes, there can be improvement in land use changes by improving carbon sinks, growing tree outside forest and conserving them for future. Now, after talking about internal flexibility, there were external flexibility also. Now, external flexibility was grouped into three forms. Emission trading was the first, joint implementation that was the second, and CDM or clean development mechanism. Now, clean development mechanism is something that many of you have already read somewhere or seen somewhere in media. So in this case, the basic point is again about cost reduction. So that was the main point. So joint implementation talks about Article 6 of the protocol that relates to Annexure 1 countries, where a firm or a government entity from country X actually finances an investment project in country Y, and this has the effect of reducing emission or enhancing sinks in Y. So country X may claim the result for itself, whereas country Y cannot then claim it against its commitment. So emission reduction derived from projects are described as Article C, and these are also called as emission reduction units. Now the most important clean development mechanism is discussed in Article 12 of Kyoto Protocol, and it combines and relates to both Annexure 1 and Annexure 2 countries or non-Annexure 1 countries. And apart from that, it is very much like joint implementation where Annexure 1 countries can fund development projects in non-Annexure 1 countries and claim any emission reduction that is entailed for themselves. So now that's very important clause. And then in international emission reduction and emission trading, this was already both emission reduction and emission trading was in existence even before Kyoto came and made it a part of mechanism to cut emission. Notwithstanding that Kyoto Protocol was in force prior to 2005, there was already emission trading and some joint implementation projects happening under CDM umbrella. Some countries have already stated that they have met their commitments even before Kyoto Protocol came into force. Now, under Kyoto Protocol, participants can buy and sell permits from one as well as another. Article 17 of the protocol states that industrialized country parties listed in Annexure B may achieve their commitments using emission trading. Now, that's important for countries that are not that are developing or underdeveloped countries. So, emission trading is one of the mechanisms that is used to reduce emissions. Emission trading relates to only the Annexure B parties. This is covered by Article 17. And the idea is basically that rather than reducing emissions within its border, Party X may claim against its reduction target a reduction in emission that takes place in Party Y. Now, Party X has to pay and would pay Party Y for the right to do this. Now, Party Y would lose the right to claim the reduction for itself in meeting its commitment. Now, that's again significant. So, this means that developed countries whose emissions are less than their assigned amount can sell the unused portion to countries whose emission exceed their assigned amount. So the net result in same is if both countries achieve their commitments, since emissions are reduced from the assigned amount for the selling country and are assigned and added to the amount of buying country. So that in that way there has been a trading and a balance for climate credit. Now when I talk about India's position, and that's very important to understand for Kyoto Protocol, India has endorsed Kyoto Protocol soon after it was adopted in 97, and India has also reiterated and supported polluter pay principle for emission reduction targets. India has also stressed the importance of step-by-step approach and cautioned that we don't need to rush into a straight-jacketed, internationally legally binding agreement. So understanding is important. Though India initially is non-committal on any emission reduction target, and still India is not very much committed, because we have to also consider the context of human rights and development rights developed. But India has elaborated National Climate Change Action Plan that came in 2008, and this is a plan and that has helped to initiate steps in mitigating climate change. There is already almost 12 to 14 years in this development, and India is doing significantly good. Now, coming to the end of this discussion, I would like to sum up this entire discussion that happened. Climate change is to be understood as a global public bad, which has non-excludable and non-arrival approach. There is self-interest of nations not to reduce emissions, problems of non-compliance, and also the intention to get a free ride on the back of mitigation nations, making reduction of GHGs. That is also an uphill task. Now, Kyoto Protocol was in place by 97, and that came in Kyoto, Japan, after a long process of negotiations on the level of emission cuts and a series of discussion. It could only be ratified by 2005, initially by 85 countries. Still, United States of America or USA did not came and didn't participated in ratification. We also need to also understand by the end of this discussion that Kyoto Protocol included flexibility provisions relating to how the commitments on GHG reduction could be met. They can be classified as internal and external. Internal flexibility has two dimensions. First, the target referred to the total of several greenhouse gas to be added together in terms of their carbon dioxide equivalent. Second, the effects of land use changes should be taken into account. And external flexibility that includes emission trading, joint implementation, and clean development mechanism. So I am sure this lecture was quite long but very fruitful to give you a basic understanding of climate change and understanding about the first protocol of climate mitigation, that was Kyoto Protocol, and was a binding agreement. With this, we come to the end of this discussion and session today. I look forward to have you in the next session of environmental economics. Thank you so much.